A board can recognize good governance and still not necessarily know how to create it. The principles shape how we think. The standards describe what effective governance looks like. But how does that become something a board can actually do? It's a bit like eating a fantastic meal without knowing how to reproduce it. You can taste the quality and perhaps you could identify the ingredients, but there's a gap between appreciating the dish and knowing how to make it. And that's where the board practices come in. Practices are the bridge between the intention and the action. They're small design decisions that help a board move closer to the standards, which are, of course, rooted in the principles. And the framework isn't asking boards to transform overnight. It's asking a much simpler question. What's one small thing we could do differently at our next meeting? Because governance improves one conversation at a time. Repeated practices become habits, and shared habits become culture. And culture is what people experience every time the board meets. Take a simple example. Imagine the board is discussing next year's budget. Now, most budget conversations begin with numbers. They talk about income, expenditure, forecast, reserves. All really important. But one practice asks the board to begin somewhere else. Mission-aligned budgets. Before discussing the figures, the board asks a simple question. How does this budget help us fulfill our mission? The budget hasn't changed. The data hasn't changed. The board hasn't changed. Only the starting point has changed. Yet suddenly, different questions begin to appear. Different trade-offs become visible. Different decisions become possible. That's what a practice does. It redirects our attention. The same idea applies throughout the deck. Some practices reshape agendas. Some improve how papers are written. Some clarify decisions. Some make ownership more explicit. Some strengthen strategic oversight. Each one is deliberately small. Changing how a board thinks together rarely requires a complete overhaul and redesign. More often, it begins with one better habit, repeated often enough that it becomes part of the culture. Some practices don't change the structure of a meeting at all. They simply change the quality of thinking within it. Imagine the board that's been discussing an agenda item for 20 minutes. Everyone seems to agree. The conversation is moving quickly. That might be exactly the right moment to reach for an Inquire card. Not because something has gone wrong, but because the board wants to test its own thinking. A simple question might ask, what assumptions are we making? Or what evidence would help us change our minds? Or whose perspective is missing? Those questions don't provide answers. They simply help the board to notice something that they may have overlooked. Sometimes the conversation carries on exactly as before. Sometimes one question changes the entire discussion. Either outcome is useful. The practice wasn't trying to create disagreement. It was trying to improve the quality of collective thinking. That's an important point. The practices aren't scripts. They're not rules. They're not things you have to work through one by one. They're simply tools. You choose the practice that helps you with the problem that you're facing today. One board might begin by redesigning its agenda, another by improving board papers, another by using better questions, another by strengthening the decision records. The direction is shared, the starting point can be different. And that's why every practice points back to a standard. The practice tells you what you can do. The standard reminds you of what you're trying to achieve. And the principle behind it explains why it matters in the first place. They're not three separate parts of the framework. They're three different levels of the same idea. Principles shape the thinking. Standards describe the quality. And practices create the change. Perhaps the most important thing to remember is that no single practice transforms governance on its own. Not one better question, not one redesigned agenda, but over time, small changes accumulate. Board papers become clearer, discussions become more focused, decisions become easier to follow, trust grows, ownership becomes clearer. The board gradually begins thinking together in a different way. And that's really what the practices are for, not to make meetings busier, but to make better governance easier.